There are plenty of fascinating people from history who helped shape the world, only to end up overlooked, without receiving anywhere near as much attention as they deserve. With history having been a predominantly male-dominated field for most of, history, influential women are probably disproportionately represented among the ranks of those overlooked. Following are 16 such women, who played significant historical roles, but whose contributions are often overlooked. Number 1. Mother Bickerdyke, the nurse who outranked William Tecumseh Sherman. Mary Ann Bickerdyke, 1817 to 1901, was a nurse and hospital administrator for the Union Army during the American Civil War. During the conflict, she helped establish hundreds of field hospitals for the wounded and sick, and after the war, she spent decades helping veterans and their families secure their pensions. Her deep concern for and tireless efforts on the soldiers' behalf earned her the nickname Mother Bickerdyke from the men in blue, and won the admiration of many of their commanders, including U.S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Born and raised in Ohio, Bickerdyke was one of the first women to attend Oberlin College. She eventually settled in Illinois, where she made a living as a botanic physician and a provider of alternative medicines, using plants and herbs. Soon after the Civil War broke out, a surgeon in an Illinois regiment and a friend of Bickerdyke wrote home about the abysmal conditions in military hospitals in Cairo, Illinois. Bickerdyke's community collected $500 worth of supplies, and she was the only volunteer willing to deliver them. Bickerdyke ended up getting appointed as a field agent for the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a private relief agency created to support sick and wounded soldiers. A strong-willed woman, she was determined to let nothing stand in the way of her quest to bring order to field hospitals and improve the lot of the soldiers being treated in them. When an army surgeon questioned her authority, she retorted that she was acting on the authority of the Lord God Almighty. Have you anything that outranks that? On another occasion, when members of General Grant's staff complained to William Tecumseh Sherman of Bickerdyke's deliberate defiance of some regulations, he threw up his hands and exclaimed, "She outranks me. I can't do a thing in the world." In addition to running hospitals, Bickerdyke accompanied Union armies, braving shot and shell so she could scour the battlefields for wounded men who had been missed by stretcher bearers, who might still be saved. Those whom she personally saved in this manner included General John Blackjack Logan, commander of the 15th Corps, who had been wounded and left on the field for dead at Fort Donelson. By the time the war was over, she had helped set up over 300 field hospitals, and had been the difference maker in saving the lives of untold thousands. Number 2. China's only female emperor. According to dynastic China's Confucian worldview, women were unfit to rule. Wu Zetian, 624-705, did not care much for that bit of Confucian conventional wisdom. From 683 to 705, she ran the country unofficially as an empress consort, then empress dowager, and finally, as official empress. She became the sole officially recognized empress during China's more than 2 millennia of imperial rule. A strong, wily, and ruthless woman, tale of her rise to power, and how she held on to it, could have taught Machiavelli some new tricks had he known of her. Wu Zetian was born into a wealthy family, and her father saw to it that she received a good education, encouraging her to read and develop her mind. That was quite unusual for her day and age, but fortunately for Wu, her father was not too hung up on convention. As a result, she grew up well versed in literature, music, history, politics, and governmental affairs. She was also drop-dead gorgeous, and at age 14, she was taken into Emperor Taizong's harem as a concubine. The combination of beauty and brains served her well. The emperor was an old stick in the mud who was not into intelligent women, and thus did not favor Wu. Being an intelligent woman, and looking ahead, she had an affair with his son and eventual successor, who was not intimidated by smart women. When he became Emperor Jaezong after his father's death, he made Wu his favorite concubine, and eventually elevated her to his second wife, a huge jump in the imperial harem's rankings. Not content to remain second fiddle, however, Wu reportedly strangled her own infant daughter and framed the emperor's first wife for the death. The intrigue worked, and Wu became the emperor's official consort. Her power grew steadily, as she steadily eliminated opponents and potential threats. When Emperor Jaezong died in 683, Wu became Empress Dowager in her own right and regent, running the empire in the name of her son, Emperor Dongzong. When Dongzong ascended the throne in his own right in 684, he tried to buck his mother and get out from under her thumb. He lasted only 6 weeks on the throne, before Wu had him deposed, exiled, and replaced with her youngest son, whom she made Emperor Ruozong. She maintained all power in her own hands, and 6 years later, she tired of bothering with any pretense about who actually ran China, and made Ruozong relinquish the throne. Wu officially proclaimed herself Empress Regnant, and ruled in that capacity until she was overthrown in 705. Number 3. The teenage girl who outdid Paul Revere. Paul Revere's place in history was cemented when his 18-mile midnight ride in April of 1775, to alert the colonial militia of the approaching British, was dramatized by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in Paul Revere's Ride. In 1777, Sybil Luddington, 1761–1839, made a 40-mile midnight ride to warn the colonial militia of approaching British troops. That was more than twice as far as Paul Revere's ride, and she did it when she was only 16. Sybil Luddington was born in Fredericksburg, now Luddington, the eldest of what would become a large family of 12 children. Her father, Henry Luddington, was a New York militia officer, and later an aide to George Washington. On the night of April 26, 1777, word reached the Luddington household that New York's governor, General William Tryon, was about to attack nearby Danbury, Connecticut, where the supplies and munitions for the entire region's militia were stored. Sybil volunteered, or was ordered by her father, accounts differ, to deliver the order for an immediate militia muster, and to rouse the countryside. In either case, the 16-year-old girl rode her horse, Star, throughout a rainy night on a 40-mile careen around the region. She traveled over unfamiliar roads, prodding the horse with a stick that she also used to knock on doors, and that came in handy to defend herself when a highwayman tried to waylay her in the dark. By the time Sybil returned home, exhausted and soaked to the bone, most of the region's 400 militia were ready to march to Danbury. They managed to beat Governor Tryon and his men, forcing the British to retreat. Sybil was praised by her neighbors, and even by George Washington. Unfortunately for her, no world-class poet took an interest in her exploits that night, or perhaps none could find anything good to rhyme with Luddington. Either way, Sybil never garnered as much attention as Revere, and her heroics were largely forgotten. Number 4. Katie Sandwina, the world's strongest woman. When most people think of 19th and early 20th century fitness freaks and performers of feats of strength, the image that comes to mind is usually a leotard-wearing broad-chested figure with handlebar mustaches. However, the fitness movement back then was actually an all-encompassing movement that did not exclude based on gender. An example was Katie Sandwina, 1884–1952, otherwise known as the Lady Hercules. She was quite the powerhouse, and an impressive performer who became a world-famous circus strongwoman. Born just outside of Vienna, Austria, in 1884, Katharina Brumbach, her birth name, came into the world on the back of a circus wagon. Her parents were circus performers from Bavaria, and Katie was destined to follow in their footsteps. Her father stood 6'6" and weighed about 270 pounds, a big man for those days. Her mother, at nearly 6 feet tall and with biceps measuring 16 inches, was a circus strongwoman herself. In other words, strength was in Katie's blood. As a teenager, Katie stood nearly 6 feet tall, and weighed a lean 200 pounds. That size and the strength that went with it, combined with her natural good looks, made her an attraction wherever she went. At circus stops, Katie performed feats of strength with dumbbells and barbells, and her father would offer 100 marks to any woman, or man, who could best her in a wrestling match. Her father never had to pay out. Katie had multiple children, but pregnancy hardly ever slowed her down. She performed her strong woman act almost until she went into labor. Katie eventually emigrated to the U.S., where she was signed up by Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, and spent decades as their featured strong woman, until she was almost 60. Her greatest moment came when she defeated the era's most famous strongman, Eugene Sandow, in a weightlifting contesting. She managed to lift 300 pounds above her head, while he was able to lift them only to his chest. One of the things that contemporaries found highly interesting about her was just how feminine she was, and those who knew her frequently remarked on how she was into makeup, getting her nails done up, and other supergirly things. It was seen as an entertaining juxtaposition for a woman who routinely had a carousel placed on her shoulders, so she could lift anywhere from 8 to a dozen people at a time. Number 5. Mary Seacole's fame once rivaled that of Florence Nightingale. Mary Seacole, 1805 to 1881, was a pioneering nurse and Crimean War heroine, who as a woman, and a black one at that, had to overcome the double prejudices of sexism and racism. A businesswoman and adventurer, she set up what came to be known as the British Hotel for convalescent officers behind the Crimean War's front lines, and cared for wounded soldiers on the battlefield. She was born in Kingston, Jamaica, to a Scottish soldier and a black mother who used traditional African and Caribbean herbal remedies, and who passed that knowledge on to her daughter. Mary Seacole and her mother ran a boarding house for invalid soldiers that was widely viewed as one of the best hotels in Kingston. The precarious health of many of the guests meant that Mary grew up with first-hand knowledge of dealing with ailments and physical crises. An inveterate traveler, she visited much of the Caribbean and Central America as well as Britain, and complemented her knowledge of traditional medicines with European medical ideas. She was in Britain during the Crimean War, and approached the War Office, asking to be sent as a nurse to Crimea, where medical care facilities were scandalously abysmal. Her request was rejected. Undaunted, Seacole funded her own way to Crimea, where she established the British Hotel near Balaclava to provide a mess table and comfortable quarters for sick and convalescent officers. She also trekked to the battlefields, sometimes under fire, to nurse the wounded. Her courage in the face of mortal danger earned her the affectionate nickname Mother Seacole. History records Florence Nightingale as the Crimean War's foremost nurse, but during the conflict, and especially among the soldiers on the ground, Seacole's fame rivaled that of Nightingale. Seacole returned to Britain after the war, destitute and in poor health. The press highlighted her plight, and in 1857, a benefit festival was held for her that was attended by thousands, including many grateful Crimean War veterans. Number 6. Patriot spy Anna Strong. Anna Smith Strong, 1740-1812, of Setauket, New York, played an important role in the Culper spy ring, the Americans' most important espionage network. The ring's leader, Abraham Woodhull, frequently traveled to New York City under the cover of his occupation as a farmer delivering produce, or to visit his sister, who lived in the city. While in New York, he gathered information about British units in the city, their dispositions, and any news he overheard from talkative loyalists and British officers. Close questioning by inquisitive British soldiers during one of those visits drove home to Woodhull the dangerousness of what he was doing. To reduce his exposure and the frequency of his travel, he began leaning more on recruiting spies in the city, using their reports instead of his personal observations. Anna Strong helped speed up the transmission of intelligence. Woodhull gathered intelligence from New York City and returned with it to Setauket on Long Island. He then delivered it to Caleb Brewster, a courier and smuggler who ran a whaleboat, who delivered it to Major Benjamin Talmadge, who finally delivered it to George Washington. It was a time-consuming process that was eventually shortened by using couriers to collect the information in New York and speedily get it to Setauket, 55 miles away. Anna Strong, a neighbor and friend of Woodhull and Brewster, used her laundry as a code to coordinate between the duo, and intelligence was ready to gather, and where it should be collected. When Brewster was in the area, ready to pick up Woodhull's reports, Anna would hang a black petticoat in her laundry as a signal to Woodhull. Woodhull would then finish compiling a report and stash it in a pre-arranged hiding spot in one of 6 coves near Setauket. Anna would then hang up white handkerchiefs to dry, their number corresponding to the number of the cove where Woodhull had stashed the report. Brewster would then go to the correct cove, pick up the report, and deliver it across the Long Island Sound. Number 7. The Godmother of Forensic Science. Frances Glessner Lee, 1878–1962, was a Chicago society dame who had a hobby that was quite unusual for women of her era: solving crimes and helping advance the science of forensics. To that end, she developed a training system for homicide detectives that she called Nutshell Studies of Unexplained Deaths, parts of which are still in use today. She is considered the godmother of forensic science. Frances Glessner Lee was the daughter of an industrialist who became fabulously wealthy from investing in International Harvester. As a young girl, she got hooked on Sherlock Holmes stories and dreamt of growing up to become a crime solver. She wanted to attend college, but her family would not permit it. She was also discouraged from pursuing her interests in forensic pathology. Her dreams did not die, however, and after the death of her father and then her brother, she inherited the International Harvester fortune at age 52. Now a millionaire heiress and society dame, she eschewed splurging on lavish parties for debutantes, tycoons, and other society types. Instead, she made a sizable endowment to the recently established Harvard Department of Legal Medicine, the country's first such institution. In addition to her financial generosity, Glessner Lee hosted week-long seminars for homicide detectives, prosecutors, and other investigators, to train them on crime investigation techniques. Her methodology, Nutshell Studies of Unexplained Deaths, consisted of 20 true crime scene dioramas that she personally reproduced in painstaking detail on dollhouse scale. Her dioramas were complete with working doors, windows, lights, and minute details, all the way down to tiny food cans and miniature mousetraps. Students were then given 90 minutes to study the scene, then try and solve the crime based on their observations. For her efforts, she was made an honorary captain in the New Hampshire State Police. 18 of her dioramas are still in use for training purposes. Number 8. Anita Newcomb McGee, founder of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Anita Newcomb McGee, 1864–1940, was a physician whose work greatly influenced America's military, and she is widely viewed as the founder of the United States Army Nurse Corps. Born in Washington, D.C., to a noted astronomer, Dr. McGee got her medical degree in 1892, and became one of the few female practicing doctors in the nation's capital. At the start of the Spanish-American War in 1898, she trained and organized volunteer nurses. The organizational skills led to her appointment as the only woman acting Assistant Surgeon General of the U.S. Army in 1898, in charge of nurses, for the duration of the war. That made Dr. McGee the first woman authorized to wear an Army officer's uniform. She wrote a manual during the conflict on nursing that was adopted by the American military and that formed the basis for nursing practices for decades thereafter. Parts of her manual survive as standard operating procedures to this day. After the war, she lobbied for a permanent nursing corps and wrote the section of legislation that was subsequently enacted into law to establish the Army Nurse Corps in 1901. In 1904, Dr. McGee led a contingent of volunteer nurses to serve in Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. She established a field hospital for the Japanese Army and trained Japanese Red Cross nurses. Given an officer's rank by the Japanese government, she inspected field hospitals and hospital ships, and served as a medical military attaché with the Japanese Army in Manchuria. Returning to America after the war, Dr. McGee resumed her medical practice, wrote about her war experiences, and lectured at the University of California. She died in 1940. and was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Number 9. The Syrian queen who challenged Rome. Septimia Zenobia, circa 240 to circa 274, was a 3rd century Syrian queen who ruled the short-lived empire of Palmyra from 267 to 272, and challenged the authority of Rome. During that stretch in power, via war, conquest, and diplomacy, Zenobia came to control and govern a huge realm that included most of the Roman Empire's eastern provinces. Born in Palmyra, a wealthy Syrian city that grew prosperous from its strategic location astride caravan trade routes, Zenobia was educated in Latin and Greek, and was fluent in Aramaic and Egyptian. She was put in charge of her family's flocks and crews of shepherds in her youth, and grew accustomed to horseback riding, the outdoors life, and developed endurance and stamina. Those assets would serve her well later on. She was married to Lucius Septimus Odenatus, Rome's client ruler of Palmyra. Her life overlapped with a decades-long period of Roman chaos and political instability that came to be known as the Crisis of the 3rd century. Taking advantage of that weakness, the Persian Sassanid Empire conquered much of the Roman East. Acting at Rome's behest, Odenatus fought off the Persians and recovered the lost provinces. For his services, he was made governor of most of the Roman East, and in 260 he crowned himself king. In 267, Odenatus and his eldest son by a previous wife were assassinated, at which point Zenobia assumed power as regent on behalf of her underage son. She also crowned herself Queen of Palmyra, and surrounded herself at court with intellectuals and philosophers. She was a remarkable queen noted for her culture, her intellect, her beauty, and her toughness. Unlike her deceased husband, Zenobia was not content to remain a Roman client. So she conquered Egypt in 269, seized a significant part of Asia Minor, and declared herself an independent ruler. Reportedly, she could march on foot long distances with her soldiers, could hunt as well as any man, and could outdrink anybody. By 270, Zenobia had conquered an empire stretching from Asia Minor to Egypt, and from Mesopotamia to the deserts of Libya. Rome was forced to take note, and in 270, a new emperor, Aurelian, restored order in the Western Roman Empire, and turned his attention to the east. Marching against Zenobia, he defeated her armies at Antioch and Emesa, and besieged her in Palmyra. She attempted to fight her way out, but was eventually captured. Zenobia was supposed to march as a trophy in Aurelian's triumph in Rome, but she denied him that satisfaction by starving herself to death in 274 during the trip to Rome. Number 10. The Greek warrior queen, Artemisia I. The Greek queen Artemisia I flourished in the 400s BC, ruled Halicarnassus in Caria, a satrapy, or province, of the Persian Empire in southwestern Anatolia. A naval commander and pirate queen, Artemisia fought for the Persians during their invasion of Greece. She won acclaim for her role in the naval battle of Salamis in 480 BC, which her side lost, but during which she distinguished herself. She was born to the king of Halicarnassus, who named her after Artemis, goddess of the hunt. Artemisia married the satrap of Caria, and after his death, she assumed the Carian throne as regent for her underage son. Contemporaries depicted her as a courageous and clever commander of men and ships, who preyed upon the Greeks during the Greco-Persian conflict. When Persia's king Xerxes invaded Greece, Artemisia distinguished herself in the naval battle of Artemisium, which was fought simultaneously with the more famous Battle of Thermopylae. She caused the Greeks so much trouble that they put a bounty on her head, offering 10,000 drachmas to whoever killed or captured her. The reward went uncollected. In the even greater naval battle of Salamis soon thereafter, Herodotus describes Artemisia as the only commander on the Persian side worthy of mention. I pass over all the other officers of the Persians, because there is no need for me to mention them, except for Artemisia, because I find it particularly remarkable that a woman should have taken part in the expedition against Greece. She took over the tyranny after her husband's death, and although she had a grown-up son and did not have to join the expedition, her manly courage impelled her to do so. She escorted Xerxes' sons to safety after the battle, then faded from recorded history. Legend has it that Artemisia fell madly in love with a man who ignored her, so she had him blinded. However, her passion continued to burn hot despite his disfigurement. To rid herself of her feelings for him, she decided to leap from a tall rock that reportedly held magical powers, such that jumping off it would snap the bonds of love. She ended up snapping her neck.